at the University of Paris X-Nanterre and the Kyiv-Mohyla Academy. Later, Dr. Gomza was a German fellow at the German Academic Exchange Service in 2013, and as I mentioned, Faculty Fulbright Development Program in 2016-2017 when he was at William & Mary. His scholarly interests work on issues ranging from democratization, contentious politics, and good governance, and his articles and books have been published in a long list of very important and prestigious venues. He also sits on the Communist and Post-Communist Studies Journal editorial board and frequently lectures to public audiences, NGOs, and think tanks. So Dr. Gomza, again, thank you so much for joining us from Lviv, and we will let you take it away from here. Thank you so much.
Thank you for the presentation, and I'm genuinely grateful to the College of William & Mary and the community to have organized this event. I'm happy to see the colleagues and friends whom I worked with for years ago, and I really mean that your solidarity and your support is really important for us here in Ukraine. So I have prepared a talk for today, and every detail I will present comes from the experience of what is currently going on in Ukraine. So you'll hear no metaphors, no epithets. That's just that will be the plain truth. However, it is not my intention to share just a personal story. Rather, I want to conceptualize on the collective understanding of the events. Still, if you are interested in any personal details, you are welcome to ask about say everyday life here in the rare city of Lviv or in Ukraine in general. During Q&A, I am open to all kinds of questions. In my talk, I want to touch on two important and interrelated questions. First, the proper way to designate the current horror in Eastern Europe. And second, a particular mindset that both hinders using this proper designation and incited the horror in question. And my concise answer to both questions is that the ongoing Russia-Ukrainian war was provoked by Russian imperialism. Unfortunately, the imperial nature of the war is often unnoticed in the by the Western general public, and this should be changed because any viable conflict resolution must account for the origins of the crisis. So that's what I'm going to talk about. But let's start with the naming. Although even lay people, especially in the United States, acknowledge the importance of proper naming, for instance, it is politically correct to say partner rather than girlfriend or boyfriend, Western pundits and media often lack cultural and historical sensitivity to properly describe the event we are now discussing, because people tend to use neutral, quote unquote, phrases like the crisis in and around Ukraine. See for this reference OSCE, or the Ukrainian crisis. See the German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, or the conflict in Ukraine. See the Institute for the Study of War, or they say Russian invasion of Ukraine. See the Council of Foreign Relations, or the war in Ukraine. See BBC News, or the Putin's war. See both Financial Times and Foreign Policy. I argue that none of those namings is fully appropriate, and some of them are outrageously wrong. Let me explain why. So conflict, by definition, from the vocabulary, is a competitive action of incompatibility. You can have a conflict of ideas and that of interest. The notion, however, is far too diluted and too cerebral to describe, for instance, a maternal hospital being wrecked by an aerial bombardment, or a civilian car being machine gunned within an evacuation corridor. Conflict is a hypocritical word. It fits a peaceful discussion regarding art or politics at a coffee house, but it misses the target to meaningfully describe the day-to-day realities in a 50,000 city of Mariupol, pounded by indiscriminate shelling every 2 minutes. So please don't use the word conflict to describe what is going on in Ukraine. Ukrainian crisis is utterly misleading. There is, in fact, a Russia-provoked crisis in Ukraine, but there is much more going in the barricaded streets, in torched armored vehicles, in civilian hospitals cut off electricity, in dead bodies of Russian invaders that are not being collected by their comrades in arms and are now devoured by seagulls, on the banks of the Bug River. Moreover, the so-called Ukrainian crisis reverberates in Russia itself, with old ladies fighting for the last pack of sugar available in the local supermarket and middle-class consumers unable to pay with their credit cards because they are suspended. So it is not a Ukrainian crisis, it is a world crisis. Next, invasion is equally limited. It is a military term that describes a particular type of operation. West European statespersons, they might be especially inclined to use the notion because they expected Russians to achieve an easy victory. Let me give you an example. When Russia started its assault, the Ukrainian foreign minister asked the German ambassador in Kyiv for help. The answer was, and I quote, "My dear friend, let's admit frankly, there is no point in any assistance. Everything will be over in 3 days." End of quotation. This is precisely the image of an invasion, a rapid, effective movement far inside the enemy's territory. Think about Hitler's invasion of the USSR. Germans, they took Mykolaiv and Kherson, moving from the west in the very first month of the action. Today, in Ukraine, almost in a month after the Russian attack, they are still only trying to encircle Kyiv, and that is some 40 miles from the northern border of Ukraine. Mykolaiv, by the way, remains unoccupied, although they approached it from the south. So unlike Germans, Russians had quite a lesser distance to cover. So in other words, invasion turned into a positional war. So you can see that war is the best term to describe what is going on, because a war, yet again, once again, by the vocabulary, is an armed conflict between different states. However, I want you to pay attention, because neither the war in Ukraine nor the Putin's war are appropriate. And once again, let me explain why. War in Ukraine describes a territory, a terrain, a theater of operation. In other words, it robs agency from Ukraine as one of the belligerents. The naming war in Ukraine implies a space where opponents contest for some gain. It smacks colonialism. It resembles the 19th century discourse with its glorified wars in Africa. And I don't think that people who use this particular phrase, who write or say war in Ukraine, they sincerely suggest that we should go back to the politics red in tooth and claw. Rather, I believe they lack cultural sensitivity and proper historical perspective. And finally, this is not a Putin's war. First, because we seldom use the name of the ruler to designate interstate wars in historiography. For instance, we say First Silesian War, albeit there were two illustrious monarchs, Frederick the Great of Prussia and Maria Theresa of Austria, who actually governed the competing states. No one says Bismarck's war to describe the Franco-Prussian War, even though Bismarck actually masterminded it. In case we do use names, they are often attached to rebel leaders who incited uprisings. For instance, think about Rakotsi War, or there in the United States, King Philip's War. So actually, we use names to designate not the rulers who quelled them, but once again, the rebels who incited those uprisings. And I must admit, American historiography does refer to the King William's War and the Queen Anne's War. But these are US historiographic conventions. And in case you want to discuss it, just ask me during the Q&A session. I'm going back to the argument why it is not the Putin's war. And my second part of the argument is that wars are generally called by the sides who are involved in the warfare. And the reason is simple. War, it is an armed conflict between states. Each belligerent wields a state apparatus, operates with an army comprising thousands of people, and the army are supported by an economy or economies that brings together millions. So let me give you a dictum. States make war. Rulers can only kindle them. Populations are implicated, sometimes adversely, sometimes enthusiastically in the war effort. And I argue that it is utterly misleading to imply that there is a Putin's war in a meaning, as the Financial Times does, to separate the Russian people from the Putin's regime. It is a mistake, and let me explain why. Several opinion polls in Russia have been taken since the war erupted, and all reservations regarding the Russian public opinion surveys notwithstanding, the population supports the war. 72% of respondents expressed pride, joy, and hope regarding the leadership and the war it has launched. There is a hashtag, "We are not ashamed," in Russian social media, with thousands of users posing with photos of devastation in Ukraine. The letter Z, a military insignia currently used by Russian troops for identification, is spontaneously put on cars and vestments by common Russians. And by the way, now I'll ask my colleagues to share a slide with Russia. Please, Kate, do it. I want the partners to see what I'm talking about. So the Russia slide, please. Here you can see no, it's Belarus, the another one. I'll continue my presentation meanwhile. And in factories and theaters, people actually line in the letter Z and chant songs of victors. Here you can see the guy a conductor in Gnesino Musical Academy, and you can see letter Z on his t-shirt, and many children who actually are being taught music. I think it is Tchaikovsky or maybe Mussorgsky while seeing that symbol. Okay, so what I'm trying to explain is that there is a reason for such behavior. And I argue that the reason is the imperialist attitude harbored by both Russian elites and the Russian population toward Ukraine. Because both elites and the populace, they are outraged by the independence of Ukraine, the nature of the Ukrainian political project that is antithetical to the Russian one, and, put it plainly, the loss of territories that were instrumentalized as the foundational stone of the Russian identity. Let me remind you that in Russian collective memory and in the collective myth, Kyiv is, quote, mother of Russian cities, and another quote, the cradle of Russian civilization. So if you lose your cradle, who are you? Where is your identity? And in addition, Ukraine used to consume goods and cultural products from Russia in huge amounts, and nobody likes to lose a client and a market. Hence, the war. And people in the West, they tend to ignore the imperial nature of the Russian state. They think of the British or the French colonial empires with huge overseas possessions and strict racial division of power. Natives rarely served administrators in the British Raj, let alone built a successful career somewhere in London. Ukrainians, however, they served in the low and middle ranks of the imperial apparatus under Romanovs. Some even governed the state during the Soviet times. So people in the West are confused. They often ask, what the hell? Where is imperialism? Ukrainians, they participated in the Russian political project. And there is a problem with this line of argument, because idiosyncratically, pundits use the adjective Russian to describe any period of the common Russo-Ukrainian history, even to describe the Soviet times. For instance, you can read a lot about Hitler's occupation of Russia, albeit Germans failed to conquer even 1/5 of the territory of the Russian Socialist Republic. But in contrast, Ukrainian Socialist Republic was entirely occupied, and Ukrainians lived and suffered due to the German diktat. And by the way, the very same territories, Kharkiv, Kyiv, and Kherson, they are currently being smitten by Russians. So to recapture what I'm trying to tell you, there was a Russian empire, but people have trouble with discerning the nature of colonial rule imposed by Russia. Actually, pundits, they tend to ignore the imperial nature of the Russian state due to the improper parallel they use. They often, as I told, think about colonial possessions, and they think that those colonial possessions must be acquired somewhere overseas, like in Britain or in France. But throughout history, colonial possessions, they were first and foremost taken in the neighborhood. Think about the Persian Empire, the Ottoman Empire, the Roman Empire. First, they conquered neighbors, and next, they allowed them, those neighbors, to assume offices within the state apparatus. For instance, several Roman emperors came from Iberia, which is Spain, the very first Roman colonial possession ever. Best Ottoman viziers were of Greek and Albanian origin. So there is nothing particular in imperial subjects making careers in the imperial apparatus. My point is, what land empires do or did, it is not a racial division of power, not a merciless exploitation of territory. It is the imposition of their cultural and political model. For instance, Ottoman subjects, they paid taxes to sultans. Roman subjects, they lived by Roman laws. And I'm not going into the discussion whether it was good or bad, beneficial or detrimental to Celts and Greeks. I want you to recall that every time a colonial possession deviated from the cultural and political rules imposed from the metropole, there was war and severe punishment. Ukraine has deviated from the Russian autocratic pan-Slavonic project, hence the logic of devastation and wasteland policy adopted by Russia. And now I'll ask to share this another slide, the slide with the Belarus, because I am building an argument that Russian imperialism is responsible for Russo-Ukrainian war. And an unexpected proof of this point is what we social scientists call a natural experiment, the one currently ongoing in Eastern Europe. Belarus has been governed by a ruthless dictator significantly longer than Russia. Lukashenko's dictatorship jailed political opposition, killed people in the streets, and has a vast repressive apparatus. However, Belarusian people, they lack the imperial attitude toward Ukraine. So unlike simple Russians, who are, quote unquote, too powerless to meaningfully oppose the war, Belarusians, they sabotage railways, and their military, their army, mutinied in order not to go and kill Ukrainians. Revealingly, a Belarusian public opinion poll shows that 98, just listen to this number, 98% of respondents consider a war with Ukraine a catastrophe. And 78% of respondents think that they are responsible for what the Belarusian regime is currently doing. The contrast with Russia and Russian public opinion is undeniable. Russians publicly support the war. They rally behind their leader. Individually, they don't feel any responsibility for the war. So Russians are killing Ukrainians in the Russo-Ukrainian war because Russian imperialist sentiment make simple Russians both susceptible to the regime propaganda and disdainful of Ukraine. Most of them, and that's what I'm trying to say, are not victims, but accomplices of the ongoing crime. Only those who are overtly opposed to the war hold the moral high ground. And unfortunately, they are a tiny minority. The Russian nation is heading toward a spiritual hangover, akin to that the German nation experienced after 1945. Tragically, Russians are drinking Bloody Mary cocktails infused with Ukrainian blood to shed their imperialism. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Gomza, for that riveting talk and really helping us think through even the choices of the words we use and the implications of those words, which is an area where we need to work hard and much harder in the West than we have. We do have this slide about Belarus. Unfortunately, the order was backwards, so we're going to work on that. And I'm thinking what we'll do is we'll put it up in Q&A, and that way we can kind of refer back to that, if that's okay with you, Dr. Gomza. Okay, let's turn then to Professor Elena Prokhorova. Let me just quickly say a few words about her. She's well known to our community. And actually, I'll read also Sasha Prokhorov's bio so that we get them both in at once. Elena Prokhorova is the director of the Russian and Post-Soviet Studies program at William & Mary. She studies Soviet and post-Soviet television, visual representations of national identity, and genre and gender theory. She teaches courses in Russian language, literary and cultural courses on 19th and 20th century Russian literature, media and communism, and contemporary Russian television, and has a long list of publications, some of which are co-authored with our next speaker, who is Alexander Prokhorov. His research interests include Russian visual culture, genre theory, and film history, and together they have co-edited works like Cinemasaurus, Russian film in contemporary context, also with Nancy Condi, and film and television genres of the late Soviet era. I could go on, but time is short again. So please take it away, Lena.
All right, let me share the screen. Yeah, we have some slides as well. All right, so for simplicity's sake, we titled our talk, Russian Media Managers as War Criminals. First, a brief history. The Information War began in 2004 during the first Ukrainian Revolution, known as the Orange Revolution, and escalated in 2014 during the Maidan Revolution and Russia's annexation of Crimea. The major tools of this warfare have been government TV channels and internet portals in Russian, English, German, French, Spanish, and Arabic, targeting the population of Russia and Ukraine, the Russian diaspora abroad, as well as audiences around the globe. Direct evidence that the Russian government weaponized its media is the fact that after the annexation of Crimea, several media managers received top military awards as though they were chief military planners. For example, in the slide is Vladimir Solovyov, Channel Russia's main propagandist, receiving the Order of Alexander Nevsky from Putin for the Crimea campaign. On the next slide, you see the lovely face of Margarita Simonyan, the head of the Russia Today propaganda television news network, which broadcasts to international audiences. The face speaks for itself. The goal of this information war has been multi-pronged: to create public support for the war in Russia, to undermine Western nations' support of Ukraine, and to undermine the unity of the West. The main points that most of you, of course, know, but it's useful, I think, to recap. The main points of the narrative that these media outlets have been pushing, all of them entirely fake, is first the claim that the democratic Maidan revolution was a US-sponsored coup, the claim that Russia was defending Russian-speaking people in Crimea in eastern Ukraine from nationals sponsored by the US, the claim that Ukraine is not a state, the claim that Ukrainians are not a civic nation. All of these points clearly, confirm what Ivan has been saying about this war being an imperialist war. Meanwhile, while this propaganda campaign was going on in Crimea and eastern Ukraine, the Russian army and special forces conducted military operations masquerading as a separatist movement. In addition to these kind of the bombardment of news, in the past 10, 15 years, a lot of money also went into media campaigns to visualize history as fantasized by the Kremlin. For example, in 2009, a Russian film studio produced a film adaptation of Nikolai Gogol's novella Taras Bulba, claiming that Ukrainian Cossacks were in fact Russians who since the 16th century have fought against Westerners, above all evil Catholic Poles. Notably, at the time, the film was released both in Russia and in Ukraine, and in 2014, it was banned in Ukraine. Multiple TV series about World War II were also released on Russian television to depict Ukrainians almost exclusively as Nazi collaborators. Meanwhile, as Ivan pointed out, all of Ukraine was occupied, but lived under fascist occupation for 4 years. On the internet, the government hired an army of trolls who masquerade as average users, often from the US and Western Europe and even Ukraine, to support Russia's agenda in the war against Ukraine through disinformation. The takeaway from all of this: the media troops definitely succeeded domestically because the majority of Russians supported the annexation of Crimea and the ongoing war in Ukraine. They did not succeed globally, and the unified support all over the globe for Ukraine is the clear evidence.
And now about the Russia's information war now. Since February 24th, Russian audiences are cut off from outside information. At this point, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok are blocked in the Russian Federation. Independent Russian media outlets such as TV channel Rain, radio station Echo of Moscow, independent sites such as Meduza were taken off the air and banned in Russia. Government media channels, television channels are conducting propaganda carpet bombing with fake news updates about liberating Ukrainians and Russians from the Kyiv government. They call it a Nazi government on propaganda channels. It is just a bit of a stretch because the Ukrainian president is Jewish, a fact not publicized by Putin's media. And by the way, Volodymyr Zelensky is not only the most famous person in the world today, but he has been extremely successful in using the media to gather support for his nation, speaking to members of parliament worldwide over the internet while never leaving the besieged Kyiv. In their wishful thinking, Russian government-controlled media spread rumors that Zelensky escaped Kyiv just like the president of Afghanistan escaped Kabul. Zelensky proved them wrong. The actual word war is banned from the public usage in Russia. And recently, the word peace and the biblical thou shalt not kill are banned as well. If you think we are exaggerating, several people were arrested by the police for holding signs with the Sixth Commandment inscribed on them. See the slide. Instead of the word war, the Russian government only allows people to use the word special operation when one refers to Russia's imperialist war in Ukraine. Recently, the Russian government adopted a new law about spreading what it calls fake news about the special operation and the Russian army, which includes prison terms up to 15 years for misrepresenting the so-called liberation of Ukrainian people. To anticipate the question whether Russians can still get access to the actual information about the bombings of apartment buildings, maternity wards, theaters turned into bomb shelters, hospitals, and just yesterday, a nursing home, most likely yes. A lot of people can do this by using VPN apps. However, many choose not to, out of fear, or, it hurts to say this, out of indifference and even outright support. Empathy is one victim of the media propaganda campaign in Russia. While the propaganda campaign was successful on domestic audiences who unfortunately support the war, according to the sociological surveys, the Russian leadership itself seems to fall victim to its own lies. For example, they seem to have assumed that they can win the so-called special operation in a few days and that Russian-speaking citizens of Ukraine would greet them with flowers. Instead, heroic Ukrainian citizens, both Ukrainian and Russian-speaking, both military and civilians, are fighting back using various languages to suggest that the Russian warship should go fuck itself. This phrase, the last communication by a defender of the Ukraine's Snake Island on the day of the invasion, took the world by storm and now has its own Wikipedia page. It seems that Russia is living in a different reality. Here we're citing former German Chancellor Angela Merkel, who in 2014, after the annexation of Crimea, suggested, after talking to Mr. Putin, that he lives in a different dimension. It looks like what Russia does well is using brutal force inside and outside the country and organizing grand Soviet-style public rallies celebrating imaginary victories. For example, this past Friday, Putin's government gathered in Moscow a 200,000 large crowd to celebrate the 8th-year anniversary of the annexation of Crimea. It was called the Liberation of Crimea. Apparently, this was supposed to be a double celebration, victory over Crimea and the rest of Ukraine, but reality corrected those plans. For this occasion, Putin, or his double, we don't know, emerged from his bunker and talked about peace and Christian piety, and no, we're not kidding. He also said that Russia is not going to stop liberating its neighbors. We would like to conclude with a reference to Umberto Eco, a literary scholar from Italy who wrote about historical fascism in his famous essay, Ur-Fascism, or sometimes it's translated as the eternal fascism, where he lists major features of this ideology as he witnessed it in fascist Italy. Among the features that he lists, 3 stand out as the most important: a call to violence, finding a scapegoat, and the cult of tradition. In case of fascist Italy, it was let's make Italy great again, just like the Roman Empire. Currently, we see these features of fascist ideology enacted by Putin's regime: appeal to tradition, make Russia great again, Braga, I guess. The cult of war, and the scapegoating. Now the scapegoats are Ukrainians and the great Satan of NATO and the US. Eco also noted that totalitarian ideology impoverishes vocabulary of its subjects, but gives them fanciful symbols. In the case of Putin's regime, they came up with their own counterpart of swastika. It is a Latin letter Z, which emerged on Russian military vehicles, but has since migrated to cars, street signs, and slogans, and people's clothing. And here, Ivan Gomza is completely right. The entire nation is complicit in this war crime. The fact that they don't see the similarity to swastika is terrifying itself. To give some positive message at the end of this dark picture of empire gone mad, we would like to cite Francis Fukuyama. In a recent article, he wrote, a Russian defeat will make possible a new birth of freedom and get us out of our funk about the declining state of global democracy. The spirit of 1989 will live on thanks to a bunch of brave Ukrainians. Thank you.
Thank you, Sasha. Thank you, Lena, for that really important presentation and also the words at the end, because if there's any hope, that's where it has to go. Let me now turn to our final presenter, last but certainly not least, is Professor Paula Pickering. She is working on collaborative research focusing on the evolving nature of civic activism in the post-communist region and its impact on political and social outcomes. Her earlier collaborative projects include studies of the impact of aid for democratization in local communities in culturally diverse Southeastern Europe and the impact of information on electoral accountability in Uganda. Her research agenda is so broad, it's hard to mention all of the work that she's been doing, but I also want to be sure to add that her mentorship of the award-winning International Community Engagement Project, the American Bosnian Collaboration, ABC, has been one of the real crown jewels of our civic engagement at William & Mary for many, many years now. And she also has worked as an analyst on Eastern Europe and as a political officer in Turkmenistan for the State Department in an earlier career from 1990 to 94, as well as a human rights officer for the OSCE in Bosnia-Herzegovina. So obviously we're talking about someone with really deep on-the-ground expertise as well. And looking at this horror from another angle is Paula Pickering. Please take it away, Paula.
Thanks, everyone. First, I want to just mention that my heart goes out to Ivan and his family for all that you've been through and continue to go through, and to all the Ukrainians for the horrors that they're experiencing now. So today I want to talk about the impact of the Russian imperial war against Ukraine on the broader region of Eastern Europe, which stretches from the Baltic states, which are the very tiny states in the north below Finland, all the way to the former Yugoslav states. And I want to make 3 points about this region. First, it's been the target of repeated invasions by empires, as all of our colleagues have been mentioning, and by larger neighbors. And I intentionally chose this map just to give you a sense of how much larger Russia is compared to our East European countries. which have all been labeled as consisting of the lands in between these large empires and neighbors. They're also the targets of extreme nationalism that seeks to undermine their sovereignty and their democracies. And they are today young democracies that need concerted Western support. So first, to talk about the lands in between and how vulnerable they are to intervention by Russia and large neighbors. Those in Eastern Europe are under no illusions about Putin's megalomaniac intentions that they fear very deeply go beyond Ukraine. Those most vulnerable to Russia's military aggression include its neighbors who are seeking closer ties with Europe. So not just Ukraine, but also Moldova and South Ossetia, the separatist areas, and Abkhazia and South Ossetia in Georgia, which is also seeking integration into the European Union, and hopefully NATO or some type of security guarantees, right? These are former Soviet states, right, which were directly and forcibly incorporated both into the Russian Empire as well as by the Soviet Union. And they're vulnerable because they're outside of the NATO security umbrella. I think particularly vulnerable include Moldova, which can be linked territorially to Russia proper if Russia tries to continue expanding its conquering and brutal besiegement of the countries, the territories along the Black Sea coast. But these are not the only areas vulnerable to intervention by Russia. The East European states that are on the eastern flank of NATO that include the Baltic states, Slovakia, Romania, they are also fearful of Russia's ambitions. The Baltic states are particularly concerned. They're so tiny. They're off this particular map, but you can see the other one. And they also have Russian-speaking populations that have been the target of Russian disinformation for decades. The prime ministers of the Czech Republic, Slovenia, and Poland recently visited Kyiv in a sign of solidarity with the Ukrainian government. And they do this, I said, literally, because as the Czech prime minister says, we know that you are also fighting for our lives, right? They have experienced the Czech Republic and Poland invasion by the Russian Empire, as well as by the Soviet Union, the Czech Republic, as recently as 1968. Right, and Slovenia also experienced invasion by the Yugoslav military, seeking to prevent it from becoming an independent democratic state. So these countries know what it's like to be invaded, and they are actively supporting the Ukrainians politically, financially, militarily, willing to also provide weapons to help the Ukrainian military protect itself. As long as they're backfilled by weapons and NATO troops to reinforce their own security. And then we all know from the media that they have been generously hosting millions of refugees who are fleeing violence in Ukraine. And I want to emphasize that they need to sustain this level of welcoming. I'm a little concerned about the welcome mat being a little bit short on this. It's vitally important to provide safety and a meaningful life opportunities for those who are fleeing this violence. My second point, right, is about the extreme nationalism that Putin is pursuing aggressively within his country and beyond it. And that he has both borrowed and reinforced these ideas from East European leaders. So in particular, I think Putin has borrowed from the former Serbian President Milosevic, right? His playbook in the 1990s when he pursued violence against all of his neighbors. Both Putin and Milosevic were leaders of countries that were the largest nations within multi-ethnic communist federations. And they both were very disgruntled about the disintegration of these multi-ethnic federations. And they have worked to kind of rectify what they believe are these unfair disintegrations. They claim that their nations instead are victims of a cabal of states, right, that are working to humiliate them, to weaken their nation, and by that way spread resentment among their populations. They go back, as Ivan has emphasized, to these imperial conquerings, right, to claim that other countries around them and other peoples around them are not real countries. They're not real nations, right? Instead, for example, that Ukraine belongs to the Russian people and the state itself is fictitious. And this is against, right, hundreds of years of distinct identities and efforts to kind of create and sustain their sovereignty against larger, more powerful, covetous neighbors. They also label other nations' leaders, as we've also heard from the Provost, as fascists, right? So they do this in order to demonize those leaders and to try to lay the groundwork for violence against them. And they use hate speech through the media, demonizing other peoples, spreading fear, and sowing division in these democracies. So I want to emphasize that Putin today is working to support renewed efforts in the Balkans, the former Yugoslav areas, to unilaterally change borders. And this is something that the West needs to be paying attention to, in addition to, of course, the violence, the horrific violence in Ukraine. So the Bosnian leader right now with Putin, right, is illegally working to withdraw from central institutions within Bosnia, to secede, just like his predecessors did in Bosnia, to spark the war in the 1990s. The Serbian world, as it's articulated, includes not just parts of Bosnia, big parts, and of Croatia, but also, again, regaining Kosovo. And all of these ethno-nationalists are supported by Putin as an effort to destabilize these democratic countries and to prevent them from integrating more firmly into European institutions. Finally, I want to emphasize what I believe is an important lesson from the wars in Bosnia and the Balkans, with which I have intimate personal experience, having been the State Department political military analyst for Eastern Europe during 4 years in the 1990s and 1 week of horrific experience in the war in Bosnia and Croatia. And that is, we must work in the West in concerted ways to support politically, economically, and militarily democratically elected governments who are the victims of this imperial aggression. And we need to confront these violent ethno-nationalist tyrants who blatantly violate international law. Right? We waited too long in Bosnia after 3.5 years of shuttling and pretending that there were negotiations being held between the aggressors and the democratically elected officials, right? 97,000 people were murdered in Bosnia. 40% of them civilians. Right? We have consistently underestimated the lengths to which these tyrants are willing to go to try to achieve their unrealistic and horrifically inhumane ambitions. And appeasement will not stop them. It will only encourage them to go further, right? And the problem is the nature of the ethno-national violence, right? When aggressors can't win the support of the populations for their agenda through indoctrination or intimidation, they use violent means to target first local elites, whether these are mayors, journalists, civic activists, as well as the national leadership who are opposed to violent extremism. They abduct them and then they imprison or they execute them. They also target not just those who are of the other group, so they're not just targeting ethnic Ukrainians, right? They're also targeting people within their own ethno-national group. So we just heard the example of they're also targeting ethnic Russian mayors, counselors, journalists, civic activists who are speaking out against this naked and inhumane aggression. So this lays bare really the lie at the heart of this ethno-nationalism is that you have to, this idea that somehow your ethnicity completely determines your political viewpoint, and instead kind of reveals how nakedly a lie that is. And secondly, a part of the violence is that in order to, in desperation, control territory and peoples who are not willing to acquiesce, they besiege cities, they cut off water, food, and they indiscriminately bomb them in order to terrorize the population, right, into fleeing or explicitly using techniques of ethnic cleansing to remove these populations and install their own puppet leaders and in an attempt to try to govern and police populations that are not their own. So because of these dynamics, the West cannot stand back. Thanks.
Thank you, Paula. It's such a sobering time, and the comparisons really do make us stand up and take notice. I want to begin, if we can, Tyler, by sharing the slide that we had a technical difficulty to share that slide. And Yvonne, I'm thinking if you can go first, we could ask you to comment on anything there, but let me also ask the first question since there are several now. So we have a question, very interesting, about comparison with US attacks on Tokyo in 1942, the Doolittle raid. An aircraft carrier sneaked close to Tokyo and unleashed 16 medium bombers on a one-way mission, not designed to devastate Japan, but to rattle the Japanese and buoy US morale. So this question was, are there still strategic weapons in Ukraine that could be used for such a purpose? Old but serviceable cruise missiles or Sukhoi fighter bombers that could slip through Russian air defenses to deliver some kind of blow to Russian sites in Russia. Is that something that Ukraine could do or would want to do? So I'll let you both refer to the map and also answer that question.
Okay, I'll start with the question because I have some, let's say, ground to the ground knowledge. So no, Ukraine has no ICBMs, and we don't possess, unlike the United States, some strategic bombers. However, Ukraine has tactical missiles, I mean ground-to-ground missiles. The most famous one is Точка U, it's like point U, and U stands for the strike, udar, for those who speak Russians. And actually, it has been used several times by Ukrainian forces to bombard military airports near the borders of Ukraine, from where the military helicopters with how to say, special operators, Russian special operators, were to be deployed. So actually, once again, we used tactical weapons to attack Russians on the Russian territory, but the supply of those weapons are quite limited. Don't forget, they're used for assault purposes, and that is not what Ukraine was going to do. So we have them in very limited quantities. Okay, and should I proceed, or maybe Paula or Yelena and Sasha want to make a comment?
Would anyone like to add on that particular issue? Otherwise, I have a second one directed toward them. Okay, I think I'll go ahead and ask the second question, and I'll combine two here, which has to do, one question is whether Russians are really believing this seemingly totally crazy lie about the so-called Nazi or fascist regime in Ukraine. And is that something that's resonating in Russian culture? And if so, how is that happening? And a question related to that perhaps has to do with the overarching ideology behind Putin's and Russia's attack, which might include elements of Russian orthodoxy. So is that part of this? Is there a religious element to it that should be noted? Maybe Sasha and Lena could start.
Well, I mean, unfortunately, we must admit that this is not new, that Russian imperial mentality saturates everything. But what I think we were talking about when we invoked Umberto Eco is really we've been, because that's our profession, we've been watching Russian propaganda news in the past, for the past 20 years, right? And the pitch of hysteria is increasingly going up and up and up. And if you ask an average person in the street of Moscow right now, because some people have been doing this, it's truly a zombified response, an impoverished vocabulary and 4 phrases. Where have you been when Donbass was being bombed by Ukrainian Nazis? It's all US's fault. There are basically a limited vocabulary of answer. So yes, it is a fascist country. And it is a very kind of, this is what a lot of people think, or at least say. A lot of reckoning will be needed, a lot of soul searching and true de-Stalinization, which never happened to the extent that it should have. At the end of this road, it's gonna be an uphill climb all the way. But yes, this is what a lot of people think, truly.
And note the Russian Orthodoxy, it's really important that the listeners, the participants, they must not forget that actually the Russian Orthodox Church has been co-opted by the Soviet KGB and the state apparatus for many years, actually since the Second World War. And it is well known, and now we have video proofs when the Orthodox priests in Russia, they actually sing Hail Mary on the armored vehicles and say, now go kill Ukrainians. So there are, once again, they are complicit to this. I mean, the church is like hand in the glove of the state apparatus in Russia. And as Yelena put it rightly, as actually it is not an old story. We have this since Peter the Great. He actually constructed the apparatus for this unification of church and state. So it supports the effort. And by the way, if you want a Ukrainian point of view, we have the Russian Orthodox Church in Ukraine. We have Ukrainian Orthodox Church and Russian Ukrainian Orthodox Church. And the point is that actually Russian Orthodox Church in Ukraine is now being terrified by what their brethren are saying. And there is like a separation now. So Russian Orthodox Church in Ukraine is trying to leave Russian Orthodox Church in Moscow.
Yeah, it's really exciting to see that development. I did get a question about the resistance in Russia. I want to make sure I put in there. So there are obviously evident arrests in Russia. There was the famous case of the news anchor with an anti-war statement. One of our listeners wants to know a little bit more about what the sources of that resistance are and could they potentially spread?
Well, we have a couple of friends who are academics and who actually went to protest. Nobody arrested them at the moment of protest, but apparently they were filmed, and later, police showed up at their doorstep.
Unmarked police. They said they were firefighters, and they were basically, you know, ringing and yeah.
Well, they didn't open the door, and actually since then we just heard from them they left the country because obviously they were one step away from being arrested. What the police does very often now, they do not approach the person at the moment of protest. They film them, and then at night they show up and in a very Stalinist kind of fashion, show up at the hour when they're the most vulnerable and try to invade their private space and arrest them.
But to answer the question whether it's likely to spread, no, I don't think so. There was a moment when, you know, like people in various cities came out at the very beginning. I think the police, the riot police, the police were given carte blanche by Putin because it was very important to suppress anything at home, right, that would resemble a mass protest. And I don't know, like 15 or 20,000 people were arrested, you know, in a matter of, I don't know, a week or 10 days. I do not see this unless there are, I don't know, there is starvation and hunger riots, which could happen.
Good.
And I would welcome, you know, dethroning this, you know, not even Putin, yes, we've been praying in all sorts of, you know, non-Christian ways for something to happen. But yeah, maybe then people will start thinking. That's the problem, that you know, the refusal to think.
Also to mention some personal stories, we have a lot of families who we know who are divided on both sides. We have a friend who is a film critic who lives in Moscow. Her son is fighting in Ukrainian army, and
she has to basically, you know, fend their attacks because she says things, obviously, open things on Facebook, and people she has known for 30 years are attacking her.
So we only have just a couple of minutes left, and we do have to end fairly close to on time because we have our captioners and students who must go. Paula, do you want a 30-second intervention? And then maybe I'll give Yvonne the last word.
Oh yeah, I just wanted to add, and maybe a question for Lena, Sasha, and Steve about the impact of the body bags that are going to come back to Russia because they cannot hide the number of people that they are losing. And I know historically, Afghanistan, Chechnya, this has been a point which has helped build momentum against the current regime.
Yeah, I have a one-sentence answer to that one, Paula, which is I think that history shows these things take several years. Typically after invasions of this nature and wars of this duration, it's not right away that the breakdowns of leadership lead to coups or revolutions, but it does happen later. And that's also a lesson of history. Yvonne, there are so many questions for you and for everyone, and we know that you also have a family waiting for you tonight because of the time difference. Again, we are so grateful to you for joining us and enlightening us with your insight on the ground. Is there anything you'd like to add before we close?
Yeah, I see there is an answer, and it is an important one about the military capability of Ukraine, and I want to comment on it. So first of all, I want to remember that Ukraine is a country of up to more than 40 million people. It is like the most populated country in Europe, I mean the Eastern Europe, so unlike Finland or Estonia. And in addition to the human capital resources, we actually have what is called in military industry, the linked cycle of armored vehicles productions. So we can actually build an armored vehicle from scratches and field it to the field, yeah? So we cannot do it now with aircraft. That's actually a problem. There is a huge disparity in the Russian aircraft capacity and Ukrainian aircraft capacity. But we use the anti-aircraft missiles provided by Soviet stockpiles and also by our Western partners. And also we actively use things like javelins and NLAW to hurt Russian tanks when we can do it, let's say, with our armored vehicles. So the point I'm trying to make is we are going to stand and stand hard. We are going to pay with the blood for the resources you give us. And actually, the best way to give the resources you have. Give them to us, we'll use them properly to hurt the imperial giant really bad.
Well, that is the appropriate time for us all to say Slava Ukraini. Thank you again, everyone. Thanks to the panelists as well as to the audience. And please stay in touch with us as events like this continue. Thank you so much.
Slava Ukraini.
Героям слава.
Thank you for your support.
Goodbye.